I'm Chief Warrant Officer for Victor Pinion, U.S. Navy Retired, telling some stories from my naval career. This one was when I was stationed at the Naval Air Station at Southweymouth, Massachusetts. One of the reasons I was there, I was the only regular Navy No, I wasn't the only regular Navy. The aviation bosun mates there were the only regular Navy people at the base. The rest of them were TARs and temporary active duty reservists. And it was a TAR base, means temporary active duty reserve. That's what TAR stood for. But their job was to support the drilling reservists, naval reservists from New England, who would drill there on Saturdays and Sundays. And my purpose for being there primarily was to serve in the crash crew and to be the instructor for all of the aviation bosun mate drilling reservists. And I loved that. But the crash crew, I discovered, was a combination crash crew, civilian military, with a civilian fire chief and a civilian assistant chief and two civilian fire captains. And we were a combination crash, aircraft crash rescue and conventional fire department for buildings. And we had all the equipment for both those. And so my position was, in addition to being the instructor, was to be the section leader of the military section of my duty section. We went port and starboard. We had two sections in the crash crew. You worked on 24, off 24, on 24, off 24, on 24 and off 72. And that's straight around, repeating that, just back and forth. The military and the civilian both. We all did that. Well, I was in the port section, and the other section, of course, is the starboard section. Well, each military section had a first class petty officer, AB, as the section leader, a AB chief, that was the crash crew chief, and each civilian section had a fire captain in charge of it. So my job as section leader was to fill out the military watch bill. We did the same duties as the civilian firefighters. The fire captain in my section filled out the civilian watch bill, and we served as crash driver operators for the crash equipment, crash trucks, and we also took care of the field arresting gear and visual landing aids, and we did the runway sweep for foreign objects on the runway several times a day, every day. Because I was an ABE, and I was the only ABE, that means counterpart arresting gear, I was in charge of the field arresting gear and visual landing aids. And on my very first day there, I discovered that equipment was in dismal condition. It was terrible condition. And the cables for the arresting gear, we had E5 Mod 1, old anchor chain on either side of the runway that had cables attached to the end of them, and the plane catch the wire and drag the anchor chain down the runway, and I'd stop them in an emergency. Well, the cables had some wear criteria and age criteria. They had wire supports supported them off the deck, and they had adjustable retention hooks to get equal tension, two cables at each end. And, but they were only be rigged at one end at a time. To support both the cables with equal tension, minimum distance off the runway surface. We had old aircraft tires that we put under it to support the cable. Well, they were all beat up, and cable, one of them be laying loose and slack on the deck, and the other one be drawn tight. And they were both rusty for each of the 4 runways. Well, we had 2 runways, but you could land either direction, so each direction of each one was a different number runway. Made basically each end of the anchor chain had cable, and you only rig it on one end at a time. Well, the cables were rusty, and the records for them was poorly maintained, and best I could determine was they had not been replaced in over 2 years, and the maximum lifespan of those cables in service was 1 year. So I made myself unpopular with my bosses in the operations department by going to them and telling them that I needed new cables for the arresting gear. And it's going to cost thousands of dollars. And they had not been funding that. They had, been using the money for other projects, cash cow. Nobody had been taking care of it, So I insisted. I showed them where it was required, and they coughed up the money somewhere, somehow. I got the new cables, and we installed them. And I would work out there and quite a bit of work. Positioning the retention hooks properly so I could have even tension on them, and dragging the big anchor chains to where they were nice and tight, and one side's not real slack, the other one have a pile of chain to throw the airplane off center when we'd catch it, So it was terrible. And this is people being complacent, just not doing their jobs. And I discovered the civilians were very complacent too, most of them. Now there were some that were very conscientious, hard-charging, good firefighters. But most of them had been around for a long time, were in their 50s and whatnot, and were tired and were just complacent, lazy. And the military were no different. They followed suit. There just were had been no one that paid attention to the field arresting gear, visual landing aids. They had not. But I did. And because I was constantly doing these things, in the wintertime, it snowed there in South Weymouth quite a bit, and we would have to pull the arresting gear cables and retention hooks off the runways and place snow flags when it first started snowing along the edge of the runway and along any obstructions around that runway, so the snow plows could tell there's an obstruction there and not plow into it. Well, here again, I'm in charge of that pretty much, but the control tower, air control tower, would call us down to put the flags out and pull the arresting gear. So they would all jump into crash trucks, and they'd all go to the same set of arresting gear. The same 2 guys would get out and pull the arresting gear cables off to the side of the runway. We're using a great big old MRS tractor, and they'd remove the retention hooks, and they'd drive along the edge of the runway to the next set of gear and put the flags out and do the same thing at each end of each runway. But the civilians are complaining about the crack trucks being out there so long, and maybe the valves and fresh water tanks, freezing the valves closed, So I listened to them and I heard them, and I talked about a way for us, send one crash truck to each set of gear and get out and pull the gear instead of 2 guys getting out and everybody else hugging the heaters and those same 2 guys doing everything. And then the same 2 guys go to the next set of gear and do it again. We could reduce the time the trucks were out of the firehouse dramatically if we sent one truck to each set of gear and a couple of people got out and did it, So I wrote that up and I took it to the fire chief for him to read and approve, and he did, and he signed it. Well, it applied to the whole Crashcrew Fire Department. But the next time, after I'd done this, like a couple of days later, I got up early in the morning. It was forecasted to be snowing. So I got up early in the morning. It's starting to snow as I'm leaving home. And I went straight to the base. And I went out, and the control tower hadn't called to pull a gear yet and put the flags out. So I went straight out there, and I'm removing the unused retention hooks and so forth, doing some advanced work so it won't take so long. And then the tower called the firehouse on the radio to pull the gear and put out the flags. Well, here they all come, all the trucks right together, heading to the same set of gear. Well, part of my plan was when they called, we would have a little meeting, take about 5 minutes, get organized, which trucks go into which set of gear and so forth, and then we'd all go. Well, they're all doing it just the same way they always did. So I got on my radio, I was in a pickup truck, and I told them, return to the firehouse for the get organized meeting. And they did, and they were livid. Who did this sailor think he was telling civilians what to do? Well, the letter or the memorandum that the fire chief had signed made it applicable to everyone, and that I would host the meetings. Okay, so I'm legal all the way, and they're angry. I mean, they just don't want me telling them what to do and to do it different than the way they've always done it. You know, okay. The fire chief kind of waffled, but he did support me because he'd done it. Well, that's the way we did it from that time on. Okay. Well, lo and behold, the Sailor of the Year recognition thing is going to come out, and they sent out to the department to recommend a Sailor of the Year for the base, for the whole base. And I'll be doggone if they didn't nominate me for that. I didn't get it. I went, and because I'd seen lots of things around the base where better leadership was needed, and when they were interviewing me, I told them about it. Well, what do you think the root cause of this problem is? Now, I'm being interviewed by the command's executive officer, and there's some department heads there. And I said, poor leadership on the part of the officers and the senior enlisted people. Now, I'm telling the very people I'm talking about that. I didn't make it. But I was the runner-up. Okay, end of that story.